Let's break down and remove the confusion associated with adult children of narcissists. Now we're going to go through a dozen, that's right, 12 various personality traits that I often see in individuals that are adult children of narcissists. Now we're going to cover a few specific areas. We're going to look at negative self-perception, emotional challenges, and positive traits. Because if you are one of these individuals, or you know these individuals, you know that you've had to overcome so much. First and foremost, let's get into it. Negative self-perception. So we have low self-esteem and self-doubt. Now what happens is that throughout this developmental process, a lot of individuals, they question themselves and they don't build a lot of confidence in who they are. And this often comes out of their narcissistic parent, who often does not encourage their sense of autonomy. Instead, the early development is about the glorification of the ego of the narcissistic parent. And we see that these individuals are often questioning their worth, and we see it started really early in life, but it continues to grow and develop as these individuals. And what happens is from there, it continues to develop this sense of chronic self-blame. And that's our second component, this chronic self-blame. And we see that these individuals, they take responsibility for everything. And they're typically conditioned to believe this or incorporate this sense of blame because the narcissistic parent, anytime something went wrong, would turn it on the child. It's the child's fault, whether it really is or not. Because remember, personality disorders, and I talk about this in other videos as well, it creates distortion of reality, this distortion of culpability, who did what, who impacted what, and it impairs taking responsibility. And we see that the adult child of a narcissistic parent often holds this chronic blame. They take blame for things that had nothing to do with them, doesn't involve them, or anything like that. And a lot of times, that chronic blame and that low self-esteem, self-doubt, it can continue to grow into difficulty setting boundaries. And what we see is that a lot of boundaries are tenuous because early in life, when they're growing up with that narcissistic parent, anytime there was a boundary, it was usually broken or bent to the benefit of the narcissistic parent. And if the child during their development would push back and try to reinforce that boundary, they were typically punished in an intensive way. And the punishment typically massively outweighed the actual incident. I call it majoring in the minors, which means that it's a minor issue, but a major response. And we see that a lot with narcissistic parents, particularly if it made the narcissistic parent feel that they were perceived poorly or they incur a narcissistic wound. Now, a narcissistic wound is when that narcissistic individual, something happens and it causes them to question or feel unsafe in their narcissism. Narcissism is a maladaptive protective mechanism. So when that's challenged with that narcissistic wound, we see that parent, that narcissistic parent, blows out of proportion. They immediately start breaking boundaries. They immediately cause that child to internalize a sense of blame, which then encourages that self-doubt and that low self-esteem. Throughout all of this, a lot of adult children of narcissists and children of narcissistic parents, they develop this insecure attachment style. They have difficulty forming trusting and healthy relationships with others. Now, when I look at attachment styles in my clients that are children of narcissists, that we typically see that they fall into that category of anxious attachment, dismissing attachment, or avoidant attachment. Now, secure attachment is ideal, and that's what the therapy component is. It's to help them grow and develop and understand healthy relationships. But this is the tricky part, is that in treatment, you have these internalized patterns that the narcissistic parent built into the child that encouraged those three components that we just talked about: setting boundaries, self-blame, low self-esteem, self-doubt. So we see those things, and it impacts that attachment and how they build relationships, current relationships. And that is so problematic, but we have to go back and revisit. And this leads us to our next section, which is emotional challenges. Now, these emotional challenges for individuals that are adult children of narcissistic parents, we see that they're often people-pleasing. They have this tendency to please others, and they prioritize the needs of others over themselves. And what happens is that when they continue to do this, it becomes maladaptive. Now, in their early developmental period, a lot of times they did this and it was adaptive. It got them through dealing with that narcissistic parent. However, in healthy relationships, we have to have a sense of self, a sense of autonomy, a sense of our own verbiage and power associated with that verbiage for us to have that nice level relationship. But those people-pleasing tendencies, it's this internal dialogue and pattern and belief that manifests in behaviors that they always give in so you are okay, so the other person is okay. And it becomes a glorification of the other. And they learn this through the narcissistic parent, and it manifests in a lot of different ways. And what we see is that the individual then goes to our next component, which is hypervigilance, that they have all of this massive red alert sense of self, always being on guard. They anticipate a lot of criticism and disapproval. And this becomes, again, goes back to that internalization from the narcissistic parent that sort of built in this pattern of beliefs and behaviors that are maladaptive. So the child, the adult child of narcissistic parent, that they're always on the lookout. They're always on guard. What could be next? What could be going on? And when will I be made to feel small? When will I feel unsafe? When will I feel as though I'm not good enough? Because the narcissistic parent didn't do things consistently. They didn't do things to make you feel bad on a consistent basis. Like Wednesdays are when we make you feel bad about yourself. I mean, of course not, because we see that it is so variable that it becomes this intermittent reinforcer. So what the child learns, and what you may have learned as an adult child of narcissistic parent, is that you always have to be on the lookout. But remember, each of these components I'm talking about, they're not mutually exclusive. So while you're being hypervigilant, you're also people-pleasing. You also have low self-doubt, and you're questioning yourself. You also have tenuous boundaries. So all of these things come into play, and it makes so much uncertainty about what to do next. And that can cause our next component, which is emotional dysregulation. And this is where you struggle to manage your emotions. And this can lead to anxiety, depression, or anger. And what I find in a lot of my clients is that it tends to build these traits that we often see in individuals along the borderline personality disorder spectrum. Now, what I'm not saying, this has to be really clear, is that if you are an adult child of a narcissistic parent, that equals or causes borderline personality disorder. Not saying that at all, not even a little. What I'm saying is that research, my clinical experience, what I see in my clients is that you start to see these traits. You start to see abandonment issue, rejection sensitivity, and it's this internalized sense of emptiness. So depression is not uncommon. Anxiety is not uncommon. In some cases, we see that there has been abuse, certainly psychological abuse, emotional abuse. So we can also see some PTSD symptoms here as well. All of this is important when you're working on these issues and understanding these issues. So emotional dysregulation, we have that emotions going up and down, up and down. It's kind of like a heart monitor, right? We see it flying up and dropping low and back and forth and back and forth. So we see that. And remember, these aren't mutually exclusive, so we know that all of these components work together. We're throwing them in the stew. And then we also see that it's difficulty with trust and intimacy. And this is particularly relevant to adult children of narcissistic parents, because as you try to build a healthy relationship, to get through and adapt, it's those old maladaptive beliefs, behaviors, and patterns that you had to utilize to your developmental situation, to what was going on in your home, to your parents' narcissistic whims is what I call it. And that means that the narcissistic parent would change their perspective, their view, and how they treated you based on what their narcissism needed, what made them feel grandiose, important, powerful, recognized, all of those narcissistic factors. So it tends to manifest in your relationship. So we see trust and intimacy is often challenged and very, very difficult. And what you need to do, and this is why therapy is so important, is that you have to go back, revisit those, but unpack them and understand them, build insight into them, because that's what the narcissistic parent typically lacks, is that insight, that understanding. So instead, We have to, because we can't do that for them. We can only do that for us. So we have to build our own insight, our own understanding, and say, you know what? For me to do it differently, I need to do A, B, C. I have to look at these, that I need to go back and look at the initial event, whatever that trigger, whatever that emotional button may be. If you're not sure what emotional buttons are, I'll put a little link right here in the video so you can check that out if you want to know what emotional buttons are. But what those things are that set up those beliefs, behaviors, and patterns, and then what is the consequence? And typically, the consequence tends to be difficulty with trust and intimacy. But now remember, everything isn't negative. Adult children of narcissistic parents have something that helps them get through it. And this is those components of positive traits. Even though they had a difficult upbringing, even though in their house they learned that they had to give in or please the narcissistic parent, otherwise it was just a nightmare. Day in, day out, inconsistency, all of that stuff. So those create positive traits in you, such as empathy and compassion. What we see is that these individuals are very emotive. They can identify emotions in others and pick up on those components. A lot of times they have a good level of deep understanding of human emotions and pain due to their own experiences. Now, it can become problematic if it becomes enmeshed, if it becomes too much, too overwhelming. That can lead to what we talked about earlier, that emotion dysregulation. But that empathy and compassion, that's a great foundation to work on. When I see it's there in my clients that are adult children of narcissists, I tap into that empathy and compassion, but it typically starts out externalized. What we want to do, and in treatment, we want to internalize it. We want to help you internalize it so you have the empathy and compassion for you. And that is so, so critical. Another component is resilience and strength. And what I see, again, in these individuals is that we see that they have developed coping mechanisms and strength to overcome adversity. They are able to tolerate, to varying degrees, but they're able to tolerate these inconsistencies. They're able to tolerate a lot of this real sort of fluid and massive pendulum swings from one end to the other. So it's this resilience, and we tap into that resilience in treatment, absolutely, to build this sense of strength, to encourage you going forward, absolutely. And then from there, we can continue to build an independence and self-reliance. What happens is you have this sense of codependency, and that codependency is that I know I'm okay when they're okay. That comes out of that developmental experience of making sure that your parent is okay. If your parent is okay and you pet the narcissism, as I've mentioned in other videos too, they're narcissists are little kitties, right? They're not happy kitties. They're little mean kitties. But, right, is that when you pet the narcissist, all is calm. So you learn that creates this sense of codependency. But in treatment, and when we tap into, is that independence and self-reliance, because your narcissistic parent probably wasn't there when you needed them. So sometimes you had to rely on yourself. And a lot of these individuals are fiercely independent. They may not want to rely on others, or they're afraid to, but that codependency is what? It's an internalized need to be needed. So you have this dichotomy at work. It's that I'm afraid to connect because you're probably going to be erratic because you learn that, right, through your developmental experience. And then you also have this drive to be independent. So where does that fall? And it's different for everybody. It creates a lot of internal confusion. But that's the benefit of therapy, is you're working to separate those things. And then lastly, we see that these individuals have a heightened intuition and sensitivity. And they're just aware of how other people feel, about how they're reacting. And their experiences has often made them, they're more in touch with others' emotions and needs. Now, absolutely, this can be skewed negative. That goes back to what I mentioned, that codependency. But you can also tap into this as a really good positive. And I usually frame this for a lot of my clients by saying, your good guts. You got to have good guts. All my clients, I genuinely believe, have good guts. We got to listen to our gut. When you meet somebody, so let's say you're single, right? And you're meeting somebody, and you're like, oh, hey, and your gut is like, this is a bad move. But we have this little family in the head, this little chorus in our head, right? Or if it's that BPD traits or whatever it may be, the codependency is calling to you, telling you. And so it's telling you, oh yeah, hey, this person's giving you attention. Hey, that's really great. We need to connect with this person. All right, they're making fun of you or they're teasing you, but they're teasing you is just being playful. Don't take it so serious. But your gut is saying, this is reminiscent of mom or dad. Don't do it. Don't get into that. And what we do is we focus on that intuition and sensitivity, and we build it. And how can you use it in order to identify healthy others and not maladaptive, unhealthy others? You absolutely can. Please check out other videos as well. I have one right here I'll put for children of narcissistic parents. You might like that as well. And please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.